The masses, contrary to prediction, did not result from growing equality of condition, from the spread of general education and its inevitable lowering of standards and popularization of content. America, the classical land of equality of condition and of general education, with all its shortcomings, know less of the modern psychology of masses than perhaps any other country in the world. It soon became apparent that highly cultured people were particularly attracted to mass movements, and that generally highly differentiated individualism and sophistication did not prevent, indeed sometimes encouraged, the self-abandonment into the mass for which the mass movements provided. So even if the people who were very very educated, who were very well informed, who were very sophisticated, that could even encourage sometimes the abandonment of the self, the self identity or the self thought and your self psychology, and it would lead for you to join into the mass movement. So it's not that if there is a very exceptional intellectual body of people in a country, or elite, or different classes, that would not prevent them into not becoming a part of the mass. In fact, it may sometimes encourage it, because this intellectual class that is there, it is very very attracted towards such mass and extremist movements where the leader has the total control over everybody. Since the obvious fact that individualization and cultivation do not prevent the formation of mass attitudes was so unexpected, it has frequently been blamed upon the morbidity or nihilism of the modern intelligentsia, upon a supposedly typical intellectual self hatred, upon the spirit's hostility to life and antagonism to vitality. Yet, the much slandered intellectuals are only the most illustrative example and the most articulate spokesman for a much more general phenomenon. Social atomization and extreme individualization preceded the mass movements, which, much more easily and earlier than they did the social label, non individualistic members of the traditional party attracted the completely unorganized, atypical non joiners who, for individualistic reasons, always had refused to recognize social links or obligations. So even the intelligentsia that was very intellectual, that may be very sophisticated, that individualization of the character did not prevent the people from not joining the mass movement. And also the non-joiners who before this had never joined any other party, who were always on a neutral stand, always in the sidelines of the community, they were not part of any particular political party, did not support any particular political party. Those were the people whom first the totalitarian leaders dwelled upon to grow the mass movement, and from there it all starts. The truth is that the masses grew out of the fragments of a highly atomized society whose competitive structure and concomitant loneliness of the individual had been held in check only through membership in a class. The chief characteristic of the mass man is not brutality and backwardness, but his isolation and lack of normal social relationships. Coming from the coming from the class ridden society of the nation state, whose ranks had been cemented with nationalistic sentiment, it is only natural that these masses, in the first helplessness of their new experience, have tended toward an especially violent nationalism, to which mass leaders have yielded against their own instincts and purposes for purely demagogic reasons. So you see that here, a classless society, the people did not really joined any particular political party, did not really have an agenda that they align themselves with, and suddenly they see a leader, they suddenly see a totalitarian regime who is trying to say that it is completely different from the political party system, that it has nothing to do with it, and it's all filled with a nationalistic sentiment, and especially at a time where their own nation is under attack and their own nation needs everything, and they themselves are under scrutiny and under a position of difficulty. So in such a case, it is these conditions, these situations that facilitate the becoming of a mass, and that mass is very important because it supports the totalitarian regime. Without the mass, a totalitarian regime cannot stand. Neither tribal nationalism nor rebellious nihilism is characteristic of or ideologically appropriate to the masses as they were to the mob. But the most gifted mass leaders of our time have still risen from the mob rather than from the masses. Hitler's biography reads like a textbook example in this respect, and the point about Stalin is that he comes from the conspiratory apparatus of the Bolshevik Party with its specific mixture of outcasts and revolutionaries. Hitler's early party, almost exclusively composed of misfits, failures, and adventurers, indeed represented the armed bohemians who were only the reverse side of bourgeois society, and whom consequently the German bourgeoisie should have been able to use successfully for its own purposes. Actually, the bourgeoisie was as much taken in by the Nazis as was the Raumschleicher faction in Reichswehr, which also thought that Hitler, whom they had used as a stool pigeon, or the essay which they had used for militaristic propaganda and paramilitary training, would act as their agents and help in the establishment of a military dictatorship. So when Hitler was taken in, of course, Hitler initially he couldn't have formed a one-man army and a one-man party. He had to join some group. So what Hitler did was he joined one group. He became the leader of that group, and the more and more people started joining that group. So there was already one established group of people. They were aligned with the same ideology. So the very early things, in the very initial days, Hitler was taken in because the the people of the group who had that particular agenda in their mind, they saw Hitler as someone. Of course, they realized the potential Hitler held, that Hitler was like a magnet for them. So the group took in Hitler as a magnet so that they could attract more and more people, and they themselves could establish a military dictatorship over the country. But then what happened was that slowly it was Hitler who all he started taking over the pre-formed group, became the leader, started, and then he put on his own agenda and started working with it. Both considered the Nazi movement in their own terms, in terms of the political philosophy of the mob, and overlooked the independent, spontaneous support given the new mob leaders by masses, as well as the mob leaders' genuine talents for creating new forms of organization. The mob, as leader of these masses, was no longer the agent of bourgeoisie or of anyone else except the masses. The totalitarian movements depended less on the structurelessness of a mass society than on the specific conditions of an atomized and individualized mass, can best be seen in a comparison of Nazism and Bolshevism, which began in their respective countries under very different circumstances. To change Lenin's revolutionary dictatorship into full totalitarian rule, Stalin had first to create artificially that atomized society which had been prepared for the Nazis in Germany by historical circumstances. So you see that there are certain conditions that are needed for the establishment of a totalitarian regime, and Stalin had to, if he wanted to become, because he wanted to become a totalitarian leader like Hitler, he had to artificially create the conditions that were there before Hitler's becoming of the leader. So whatever conditions were there before Hitler, became before the totalitarian regime was established in Germany, Stalin himself artificially replicated those circumstances in Russia, and only after after the replication of those circumstances was he able to establish a totalitarian regime. What are those circumstances or situations that he had to replicate and artificate to, come into power? The October Revolution's amazingly easy victory occurred in a country where a despotic and centralized bureaucracy governed a structureless mass population, which neither the remnants of the rural feudal orders nor the weak, nascent, urban capitalist classes had organized. When Lenin said that nowhere in the world would it have been so easy to win power and so difficult to keep it, he was aware not only of the weakness of the Russian working class but of anarchic social conditions in general which favored sudden changes. Without the instincts of a mass leader, he was no orator and had a passion for public admission and analysis of his own errors, which is against the rules of even ordinary demagogy. Lenin seized at once upon all the possible differentiations, social, national, profession that might bring some structure into the population, and he seemed convinced that in such stratification lay the salvation of the revolution. He winced that in such stratification he legalized the anarchic expropriation of the landowners by the rural masses and established thereby for the first and probably last time in Russia that emancipated peasant class, which since the French Revolution had been the firmest supporter of the Western nation states. He tried to strengthen the working class by encouraging independent trade unions. He tolerated the timid appearance of a new middle class, which resulted from the NEP policy after the end of the Civil War. He introduced further distinguishing features by organizing and sometimes inventing as many nationalities as possible, furthering national consciousness and awareness of historical and cultural differences even among the most primitive tribes in the Soviet Union. So this is all the work of Lenin. Or he did all of that. So he saw that okay, there was a very structureless mass. There was the people were living, but in a very structureless fashion. There was no structure provided to them. There was no one sense of identity, no commonness as such. That is needed to emit power to the nation. So Lenin did all that. He kind of organized and structured them. He segregated different professions. He called upon nationals. He started doing providing all these facilities in the Soviet Union. So it was Lenin who first organized. So he basically prepared the base for the Soviet Union, upon which then Stalin comes over and then builds his building of totalitarian regime. Okay. It seems clear in that in these purely practical political matters, Lenin followed his great instincts for statesmanship rather than his Marxist convictions. His policy, at any rate, proves that he was more frightened by the absence of social and other structure than by the possible development of centrifugal tendencies in the newly emancipated nationalities, or even by the growth of a new bourgeoisie or of the newly established middle and peasant classes. There is no doubt that Lenin suffered his greatest defeat when, with the outbreak of the Civil War, the supreme power that he originally planned to concentrate in the Soviets definitely passed into the hands of the party bureaucracy. But even this development, tragic as it was for the course of the revolution, would not necessarily have led to totalitarianism. So Lenin did the work of building everything. He gave a structure to the mass, who to the differentiated and the distinct, basically sprinkled people that were living in the Soviet Union. And he planned on to take, for himself a supreme position and supreme power in the running of the Soviet Union. But what happened was that after doing that, after he prepared the base, all the power then was taken by the party bureaucracy. That means Lenin wanted he himself as the one with most of the power. But then his power, his sole power that he wanted for himself, shifted to the party bureaucracy, all people collective power. So his sole power was turned into collective power by the party bureaucracy. But then these are also not the reasons why totalitarian regime, or the circumstances or the situations under which totalitarian regime was established. A one party dictatorship added only one more class to the already developing social stratification of the country, that is, bureaucracy, which, according to socialist critics of the revolution, possessed the state as private property. At the moment of Lenin's death, the roads were still open. The formation of workers, peasants, and middle classes need not necessarily have led to the class struggle which had been characteristic of European capitalism. Agriculture could still be developed on a collective, cooperative, or private basis, and the national economy was still free to follow a socialist, state capitalist, or a free enterprise pattern. None of these alternatives would have automatically destroyed the new structure of the country. So these are basically the situation. Okay, the situation before Stalin came over. So how, from where did they start? What did Lenin contribute to it? All these points, and after Lenin's death. So, of course, now there was already Lenin had was able to organize the society in such a way that there was stratification of people. The classes were being formed. There was one elite class, there was one educated class, there was one middle class, there was an earning class. There were so many different classes all over, and Lenin was the person who was responsible for it. So basically, he did something that is not needed in a totalitarian regime. Totalitarian regime do not work well with classes. They need a classless society. They need a mass who don't have any stratifications in them. But Lenin was the one who made these stratifications in the first place. So even after all of these classes, now there was another class added to it, that is a bureaucracy. So bureaucracy is basically the class, the power owning class, and the legislative class. Okay, so it makes decisions, it has a lot of power, it is very rich. So there are different, even in the noble classes there are different classes present. If you talk about the Nobel classes, so those are basically people who have come down after the hierarchy of power. So the power has been passed down to them through dynastic rule, or through hierarchy, or something like that. Then you can say there are the elite class, there are the wealthy affluent class, there are the affluent merchants, there's the intellectual class. So all of these are different categories of even the rich class. Some have power, some have money, some have intellect, some have power and money both. So all of these things. So even if you talk about the upper class, there are stratifications in an upper class also. So the bureaucracy is basically the class which has a lot of money, which has a lot of power, which has a lot of legislative competencies in itself. All these new classes and nationalities were in Stalin's way when he began to prepare the country for totalitarian government. So of course, totalitarian regime rest on sole support of the masses. They need a huge, huge base of the masses. Even a small crack, that means even a small stratification in the masses, and the totalitarian regime just falls down. So these stratifications, these different classes that were developed by Lenin, in a sense, these were all going against Stalin's plan to establish a totalitarian regime. In order to fabricate an atomist and structureless mass, he had first to liquidate the remnants of power in the Soviets, which is the chief organ of national representation, still played a certain role and prevented absolute rule by the party hierarchy. Therefore, he first undermined the National Soviets through the introduction of Bolshevik cells, from which alone the higher functionaries to the central committees were appointed. By 1930, the last traces of former communal institutions had disappeared and had been replaced by a firmly centralized party bureaucracy whose tendencies towards Russification were not too different from those of the Tsarist regimes, except that the new bureaucrats were no longer afraid of literacy. The Bolshevik government then proceeded to the liquidation of classes and started, for ideological and propaganda reasons, with the property owning classes, the new middle class in the cities, and the peasants in the country. Because of the combinations of numbers and property, the peasants up to then had been potentially the most powerful class in the union. Their liquidation consequently was more thorough and more cruel than that of the other group, and was carried through by artificial famine and deportation under the pretext of expropriation of the collapse and cultivization. Okay, collectivization. So you see that first started the liquidation of the party bureaucracy. That means the breaking up of the party bureaucracy. There was one very centralized party that was holding all the power, and it was not that the power was distributed among different classes, even in the upper class. Some, for example, the legislative power was being held by one bureaucracy, the intellectual power was being held by the economic power was being held by the wealth was held being by one. So first of all, those classes were completely just distinguished and vanished, and it formed one central strong bureaucracy with all those resources and all those powers. Then next, when came to the middle class and the middle class in the cities and the property owning classes and the peasants in the countryside. So first there was an artificial famine done, so the peasants were just completely gotten rid of their property because they were a very powerful community in the countryside and also had a lot of say in the union. So the peasants got rid of their property and their power because Stalin instilled an artificial famine. The liquidation of the middle and peasant classes was completed in the early 30s. Those who were not among the many millions of dead or the millions of deported slave laborers had learned who is the master here, had realized that their lives and the lives of their families depended not upon their fellow citizens but exclusively on the whims of the government, which they faced in complete loneliness without any help whatsoever from the group to which they happened to belong. So, what is Stalin doing is he is increasing the dependency of the citizens on the government, on his regime that he is forming. He does not want that the mass or the people do anything on their own. Everything should go through the government. The exact moment when collectivization produced a new peasant rebound by common interest, which, owing to its numerical and economic key position in the country's economy, again presented a potential danger to totalitarian rule, cannot be determined either from statistics or documentary sources. But for those who know how to read totalitarian source material, this moment had come 2 years before Stalin died, when he proposed to dissolve the collectives and transform them into larger units. He did not live to carry out this plan. This time, the sacrifices would have been still greater and the chaotic consequences for the total economy still more catastrophic than the liquidation of the first peasant class. But there is no reason to doubt that he might have succeeded. There is no class that cannot be wiped out if a sufficient number of its members are murdered. So you see how Stalin is going on dissolving all of these different classes. He does not want any stratification, any class, anything. He just wants a big, huge mass, like a lump of people, to be even more precise. The next class to be liquidated as a group were the workers. As a class, they were much weaker and offered much less resistance than the peasants because their spontaneous expropriation of factory owners during the revolution, unlike the peasants' expropriation of landowners, had been frustrated at once by the government, which confiscated the factories as state property under the pretext that the state belonged to the proletariat in any event. The Stakhanov system, adopted in the early 30s, broke up all solidarity and class consciousness among the workers, first by the ferocious competition and second by the temporary solidification of a Stakhanovite aristocracy whose social distance from the ordinary worker naturally was felt more acutely than the distance between the workers and the management. This process was completed in 1938 with the introduction of the labor book, which transformed the whole Russian worker class officially into a gigantic forced labor force. So you see that after the peasantry was still a difficult task because they had a lot of resources, money and power and say in the countryside. But then the worker class was very easy because already they did have some amount of unity amongst them, but they did not have that many resources with them. They were a weaker class, and how Stalin's government broke them was they quickly took all the factories under them, stating that all the resources, all the factories, all the industries are state property. So all of those factories and industries were taken over by the Stalin's government, and then that is how there was a complete overrule of the workers class. There was a complete overrule over the workers class, and the workers class was completely dissolved. On top of these measures came the liquidation of that bureaucracy which had helped to carry out the previous liquidation measures. It took Stalin about 2 years from 1936 to 1938 to rid himself of the whole administrative and military aristocracy of the Soviet society. Nearly all offices, factories, economic and cultural bodies, government, party, and military bureaus came into new hands when nearly half the administrative personnel, party and non party, had been swept out. More than 50% of all members had at least 8 million more were liquidated. Again, the introduction of an interior passport on which all departures from one city to another have to be registered and authorized completed the destruction of the party bureaucracy as a class. So you see how Stalin is going about that, what was his ideology, how he took complete control over everything. First of all, his first step was to install a central bureaucracy system. Then they went on just vanishing all the different classes, the peasantry class, the middle working class, the worker class, the intellectual class, all of those were dissolved. And at the last stage of the dissolution of classes was the central bureaucracy itself that had previously helped in the dissolve of the peasantry and the worker class. So now there was not even a single class, and all the people were just completely one big lump of mass, one big lump of people. And then what Stalin did was the introduction of a passport, that if you're moving from one city to another, you will have to take the use of a passport, like we do when we move from one country to another today. As for its juridical status, the bureaucracy, along with the party functionaries, was now on the same level with the workers. It too had now become a part of the vast multitude of Russian forced laborers, and its status as a privileged class in Soviet society was a thing of the past. So the bureaucracy, that was, of course, the legislators, the law-making people, the judiciary people, who ensured that of course the law was being followed, and in the case of law breach were punished. So the judiciary, the executives, the legislature, the workers, the peasants, the professionals, the elite, the nobles, every single class was now at parity, was now equal. There was no difference that the judiciary had more power, or a person belonging to the domain of judiciary had more power over the peasant or the worker. There is no class now. All the people have come to the same level and the same status. And since this general purge ended with the liquidation of the highest police officials, the same who had organized the general purge in the first place, not even the cadres of the JPU, which had been carried out the terror, could any longer delude themselves at that as a that as a group they represented anything at all, let alone power. None of these immense sacrifices in human life is motivated by a hizodta in the old sense of the term. None of the liquidated social strata was hostile to the regime or likely to become hostile in the foreseeable future. Actively organized opposition has ceased to exist in the by 1930, when Stalin, in his speech to the 16th Party Congress, outlawed the rightist and leftist deviations inside the party. And even these feeble oppositions had hardly been able to base themselves on any of these or the existing classes. So there was no opposition, there was no different judiciary, there was no bureaucracy, no legislative, no peasants, no worker class. There was no class existing at all. There was no opposition. Even in the party, there was no rightist thought or the leftist thought or anything for that matter. Dictatorial terror distinguished from totalitarian terror insofar as it threatens only authentic opponents but not harmless citizens without political opinions, had been grim enough to suffocate all political life, open or clandestine, even before Lenin's death. Intervention from abroad, which might ally itself with one of the dissatisfied sections in the population, was no longer a danger. When by 1930 the Soviet regime had been recognized by a majority of governments and concluded commercial and other international agreements with many countries. So now the internally in the Soviet Union, everything was dissolved. There was no hope. So the only hope left was from international support, that any other country intervenes into the working of the government, into the working of Stalin, and somehow help them or provide them with some assistance or anything for that matter. But that support was also taken away from them when in 1930 the other governments, the other countries recognized Stalin's government, and they started conducting international business and agreements with Stalin's government. So now the Stalin's rule was even legitimized by international rule. So officially now they had no hope. The population, the mass of the Soviet Union had no help. There was no scope for any help from any other place whatsoever, from any other country, from any other city, from any other class, from any other group, from any other, whether it be no police official, no, it was not that these professions were completely taken away from them. No, the professions existed, just the class of the people did not exist. They did not hold that much power that as a group they could do anything together. If the liquidation of classes made no political sense, it was positively disastrous for the Soviet economy. The consequences of the artificial famine in 1933 were felt for years throughout the country. The introduction of the Stakhanov system in 1935, with its arbitrary speed up of individual output and its complete disregard of the necessities for teamwork in industrial production, resulted in a chaotic imbalance of the young industry. The liquidation of the bureaucracy, that is, of the class of factory managers and engineers, finally deprived industrial enterprises of what little experience and know-how the new Russian technical intelligentsia had been able to acquire. So you see that now all classes have been liquidated, but then it also proved something for the Soviet economy. What happened was that the Stakhanov system was adopted. Now, in the Stakhanov system, basically, as you can see here, arbitrary speed up of individual output and its complete disregard of necessities for teamwork in industrial production. That means every individual started working harder and harder and harder, that was required. And they the Stakhanov system first started with coal industries, and then it later spread to other parts and other parts of economy and industry also. So basically it was that one individual was producing much more than that was needed, so they were working tirelessly hard and hard and hard. Equality of condition among their subjects has been one of the foremost concerns of despotisms and tyrannies since ancient times, yet such equalization is not sufficient for totalitarian rule, because it leaves more or less intact certain non-political communal bonds between the subjects, such as family ties and common cultural interest. If totalitarianism takes its own claim seriously, it must come to the point where it has to finish once and for all with the neutrality of chess, that is, with the autonomous existence of any activity whatsoever. The lovers of chess for the sake of chess, aptly compared by the liquidator with the lovers of art for art's sake, are not yet absolutely atomized elements in the mass society whose completely heterogeneous uniformity is one of the primary conditions for totalitarianism. From the point of view of totalitarian rulers, a society devoted to chess for the sake of chess is only in degree different and less dangerous than a class of farmers for the sake of farming. Himmler quite aptly defined the SS members as the new type of man who, under no circumstances, will ever do a thing for its own sake. So, SS members. Mass atomization in Soviet society was achieved by the skillful use of repeated purges, which invariably precede actual group liquidation. In order to destroy all social and family ties, the purges are conducted in such a way as to threaten with the same fate they defended in all his ordinary relations, from mere acquaintances up to his closest friends and relatives. The consequence of the simple and ingenious device of guilt by association is that as soon as a man is accused, his former friends are transformed immediately into his bitterest enemies. In order to save their own skins, they volunteer information in Russian with denunciations to corroborate the non existent evidence against him. This obviously is the only way to prove their own trustworthiness. So, such was the control of Stalin over everybody that it not only dissolved all the classes, it was not only reflected in the political structure of the country, but a very personal and family structure of the country as well. That, if a person was caught doing anything wrong, doing anything against Stalin or Stalin's government, or scheming against Stalin, he was punished in such a way. He had to he had to face such a fate that it all started that his closest friends and families and relatives all started disowning him. Okay, in a case like this, they would just disown him, that they have no ties with him. And they would start presenting evidences which were malab, to prove their loyalty and to prove that they were clean, and evidence against, they were clean, they did not have any evidence against them, but they still would provide the Stalin's government with all the necessary material and an evidence that okay, we don't have any relation with him, we have disowned him, denunciation would take place. So such was the condition that even in the family ties, and they would completely just disregard all ties with the person. Retrospectively, they will try to prove that their acquaintance or friendship with the accused was only a pretext for spying on him and revealing him as a saboteur, a Trotskyite, um, a foreign spy, or a fascist, merit being gauged by the number of your denunciations of close comrades. It is obvious that the most elementary caution demands that one avoid all intimate contacts if possible, not in order to prevent discovery of one's secret thoughts, but rather to eliminate. And after that, they would start acting that okay, we were not actually close to him, we were not actually his or her friends, we were just spying on him to see that whether he is not a fascist, or he's not a spy or somebody else, or he's not going under the government. We don't have any ties with him, but they would completely disown him in such a matter. And later on, it started happening that nobody would be so close to anybody then. They would all they started getting their distances from every other person, because later on, if person is somehow caught or something, then later on it becomes very difficult to state that they are not close to him. So they would start distancing, everybody would start distancing everybody from everybody, so that they don't have to later on, if anything happens, they don't have to explain themselves or prove themselves. It is obvious that the most elementary caution demands that one avoid all intimate contacts if possible, not in order to prevent discovery of one's secrets, but rather to eliminate in almost certain case of future trouble. All persons who might not have only an ordinary cheap interest in your denunciation, but an irresistible need to bring about your ruin simply because they are in danger of their own lives. In the last analysis, it has been through the development of this device to its farthest and most fantastic extremes that Bolshevik rulers have succeeded in creating an atomized and individualized society, the like of which we have never seen before, which events or catastrophes alone would hardly have brought about. So you see that how all of that Stalin has done. It first of all liquidated all the classes, the unity between the people, and now there was the society had become highly individualized, that even the family and the familial and the relational ties that were between people. So professionally, all ties have been broken. Professionally, there would not be a conjugation of the worker class or the peasantry class, the judiciary class. Professionally, all of that formation of a class or a group of people was over. And now, even privately, in their private lives, there would be no huge gatherings, no one family of any kind, or close friends and relatives and acquaintances. Now the society had become atomized and individualized. So it was like an atom, a single person existing, and just four or five people, just the husband, the wife, and the kids existing together, and their parents, or so. Even sometimes the parents would disown them, and the sons and daughters would break off their ties. So it was that the society had become so highly individualized in its structure, that there was just one individual existing, and there was no scope, whether professionally or privately or publicly, there was no scope for a mass or for a class or for a group of people to form that would go against Stalin. Because the moment there is a group formed, and the number of people increase in that group, they can anytime have seize that much power to go against the government. Totalitarian movements are mass organizations of atomized, isolated individuals. Compared with all other parties and movements, their most conspicuous external characteristic is their demand for total, unrestricted, unconditional, and unalterable loyalty to of the individual member. So, in every aspect of life, in every whichever way possible, total, complete submission to the ruler. This demand is made by the leaders of totalitarian movements even before they seize power. It usually precedes the total organization of the country under their actual rule, and it follows from the claim of their ideologies that their organizations will encompass in due course the entire human race. Where, however, totalitarian rule has not been prepared by a totalitarian movement, the movement has to be organized afterward, and the conditions for its growth have artificially to be created in order to make total loyalty the psychological basis for total domination at all possible. Such loyalty can be expected only from the completely isolated human being who, without any other social ties to family, friends, comrades, or even acquaintances, derives his sense of having a place in the world only from his belonging to a movement, his membership in the party. So now, what Stalin did was, or how the totalitarian regime, completely takes over the person, that the person has no thought about anything, that the person is completely submitted to the regime. That we have already studied this in part 1, that how there is no way that even intellect or sense or experience can reach the conscious of the person. That much a person is engulfed by the totalitarian regime. And how it happens is, the reason for that is that professionally the class has been there are no stratifications anymore. So there is no grouping of people. Okay, now even privately, the family, the acquaintances, the friends, the close relatives, all of that, that was the formation of a group, even that has gone. So now the individual has nothing in his or her life. He or she, matlab, the individual just has his work and home, nothing else. No other group to go to, nobody else to talk to, nobody else to follow or discuss something with. Nothing, they don't have anything. So now that the society has become such individualized, the individual will of course give 100% and 200% of his loyalty to the party. And his sole thing that is left in his life, his or her life, after working, after coming from work is the membership in the party, that he's a member of the party. So there is no other identity of the person than being a member of the party, because he's not part of a family, he's not part of a group, or a working thing, a work group or anything. He does not identify himself with the work group. So he has no more identity then. It's just his name, and that he's a member of the party. And that is why, that is the reason, that is the way how people can completely submit themselves, because they don't have anything else left in their lives. That is how they pave the way for the complete submission of the individual. So that's why we may think, when you must have read this in the previous past, it must have seen that how is it even possible that a person completely submits, and how can they just hypnotize the person. Well, this is the reason, because the person does not have anything else left in their life, there is no other identity. Total loyalty is possible only when fidelity is emptied of all concrete content from which changes of mind might naturally arise. The totalitarian movements, each in its own way, have done their utmost to get rid of the party programs which specified concrete content and which they inherited from earlier non totalitarian stages of development. No matter how radically they might have been phrased, every definite political goal which does not simply assert or circumscribe the claim to world rule, every political program which deals with issues more specific than ideological questions of importance for centuries, is an obstruction of totalitarianism. Hitler's greatest achievement in the organization of the Nazi movement, which he gradually built up from the obscure crackpot membership of a typically nationalistic little party, was that he unburdened the movement of the party's earlier program, not by changing or officially abolishing it, but simply by refusing to talk about it or discuss its points, whose relative moderateness of content and phraseology were very soon outdated. So Stalin's task in this, as in other respects, is much more formidable. The socialist program of the Bolshevik Party was a much more troublesome burden than the 25 points of an amateur economist and a crackpot politician. But Stalin achieved eventually, after having abolished the factions of the Russian party, the same result through the constant zigzag of the Communist Party lines and the constant reinterpretation and application of Marxism, which voided the doctrine of all its contents because it was no longer possible to predict what course or action it would inspire. The fact that the most perfect education in Marxism and Leninism was no guide whatever for political behavior, that, on the contrary, one could follow the party line only if one repeated each morning what Stalin had announced the night before, naturally resulted in the same state of mind, the same concentrated obedience, uninvited by any attempt to understand what one was doing. That Himmler's ingenious watchword for his SS men expressed, "My honor is my loyalty." So you see that earlier they start with, okay, we are going to follow this particular policy, we are going to follow this particular ideology, and Stalin started with Leninism or Marxism. But later on, even the contents of Leninism and Marxism were emptied out, Stalin, and nobody could predict what new stance or what new thing would inspire or come out of Marxism. Okay, we see that today, if we have any ideology, we try to connect it to different, let's say if we have to connect it to Gandhism, so we try to find some common points, some mutual points, that okay, according to Gandhism, this would be the course of action for this particular policy, even if that policy was not there, when Gandhi was actually there. So what Stalin would do is that he would come out with new things, with new different policies, new different agendas, and he would link it to Marxism, as in it was inspired by Marxism. But you could not really anticipate before how come it was inspired from Marxism. Such was the case. And what would happen is, at one time they had no such ideology to follow from, so they were completely following whatever Stalin was saying. So in the morning when they would get up, it's not literally that they would get up and repeat, but it's just a metaphor to say that, when in morning they would get up and they would repeat whatever has been told to them the night before. So for example, the SS line or the SS men had this, "My honor is my loyalty." So they would just, this line was such a catchphrase, and such a mousetrap, that it would quickly be installed in one person's mind. And loyalty, when a person is repeatedly hearing to this phrase, it's saying the phrase and seeing this phrase everywhere, they this psychologically, this thing of loyalty, this feeling of loyalty would come into them. So even if a person is not there, he or she would become loyal to the party. Lack of or ignoring of party program is by itself not necessarily a sign of totalitarianism. The first to consider programs and platforms as needless scraps of paper and embarrassing promises inconsistent with the style and impetus of a movement was Mussolini, with his fascist philosophy of activism and inspiration through the historical movement itself. Mere lust for power combined with contempt for talkative articulation of what they intend to do with its characteristic of all mob leaders, but does not come up to standards of totalitarianism. The true goal of fascism was only to seize power and establish the fascist elite as inconsistent ruler over the country. Totalitarianism is never content to rule by external means, namely through the state and a machinery of violence, thanks to its peculiar ideology and the role assigned to it in this apparatus of coercion. Totalitarianism has discovered a means of dominating and terrorizing human beings from within. In this sense, it eliminates distance between the rulers and the ruled, and achieves a condition in which power and the will to power, as we understand them, play no role, or at best a secondary role. So you see, while Mussolini was not able to install a totalitarian regime, and could only install a fascism, he could only install a fascist rule, was first that Italy did not have much of a population, the sheer number of people that are needed for a totalitarian regime, and secondly, all that Mussolini wanted was to rule over the people through means of violence. But totalitarian regimes never want to do that. They don't want an external rule over people, that through the use of violence, and externally they rule over people. Totalitarian regime, what it does is that from within it removes everything. It completely blanks out the person, and so that everything that is left within the person is just that totalitarian regime and its ideology. Okay, and the sense of power, and the will to power, and sense and intelligence, and all of that is just gone away. So that is why Mussolini couldn't establish a totalitarian regime, because he was just keen on ruling the people through violence, and that is an external force. Totalitarian regime wants that every person from within accepts, and the person, not just only with the help of terror, or the horrifications of violence, etc. From within, everything is completely blanked out, and basically like turn them into robots, that the only source of power is the totalitarian regime. In substance, the totalitarian leader is nothing more nor less than the functionary of the masses he leads. He is not a power hungry individual imposing a tyrannical and arbitrary will upon his subjects. Being a mere functionary, he can be replaced at any time, and he depends just as much on the will of the masses he embodies as the masses depend on him. Without him, they would lack external representation and remain an amorphous horde. Without the masses, the leader is non entity. So a totalitarian ruler never is power hungry or anything like that. They just want to be in power. That is not what the totalitarian leader would want or wants to do. So totalitarian leaders are very quickly replaceable, because it's not that they just have to stay in power or have external power over people. That's not the case. In totalitarian regime, the ruler does not want any distance from the ruled. In a fascist rule, in a despotic rule, in any other kind of rule, the ruler wants to stand out. The ruler wants everything for himself. He wants to rule the whole, country, nation, state, whatever, and he wants, maybe the subjects are suffering. The fascist ruler is not cared with it. He just wants everything for himself. He wants to rule, and even through the violence. But in totalitarian regime, the ruler does not want any distance between him and the ruled people. He does not see himself as a power hungry person who just needs power. So, Hitler, who was fully aware of the interdependence, expressed it once in his speech: all that you are through me; all that I am through you alone. We are only too inclined to belittle such statements or to misunderstand them, in the sense that acting is defined here in terms of giving and executing orders, as has happened too often in the political transition tradition of and history of the West. But this idea has always presupposed someone in command who thinks and wills, and then imposes his thought and will on thought and will deprived group, be it by persuasion, authority, or violence. Hitler, however, was of the opinion that even thinking only by virtue of giving or executing orders, and thereby eliminated even theoretically the distinction between thinking and acting on one hand and between the rulers and the ruled on the other. So you may say that when Hitler said this line that whatever you are through me, and whatever I am all because of you. So we may interpret this as a line, as that it was a propaganda for his thing, and this it was a line, it was a mere line that was added to the speech so that the people are impressed by it. That was not the case. Hitler did not really have a distinction between thinking and acting. He actually meant by these, he actually knew that he is standing there, he is giving the speech only because he has the mass support. The moment the mass removes their support, he will just vanish, that he does not have a place. And Hitler actually wanted himself to combine with the ruled people. He did not see himself as a very sole ruler, or a very kind of, he actually wanted something to do with the rule. He just wanted that there should be one thinking of all people. There should be no other thought that should exist in the nation. Every person should become like a robot and just work tirelessly for the nation, and just they have nothing, they have no emotions or anything within them. Neither National Socialism nor Bolshevism has ever proclaimed a new form of government or asserted that its goals were reached with the seizure of power and the control of the state machinery. Their idea of domination was something that no state and no mere apparatus of violence can ever achieve, but only a movement that is constantly kept in motion, namely the permanent domination of each single individual in each and every sphere of life. So it was not a kind of, it was not that it was something asserted, it was not a form of government, you know it was not a machinery, it was not a domination, or through violence or anything. It was just something, it was a motion of thing. It kept on going and going and going, and it was within every individual. So it was not something external, but something that was instilled within the persons within. The seizure of power through the means of violence is never an end in itself, but only the means to an end. And the seizure of power in any given country is only a welcome transitory stage, but never the end of the movement. This practical goal of the movement is to organize as many people as possible within its framework and to set up and keep them in motion. A political goal that would constitute at the end of the movement simply does not exist. So this movement, this totalitarian regime, is established with the goal of never ending anything. It just wants it to keep moving and moving and moving. That is why power, the gain of power is not something that the totalitarian ruler wants out of it.